It's such a pleasure to have Dr. T. Colin Campbell of the China Study and his wife Karen, whom I would like to give an award for the best smile I've ever seen in my life, if I may. I like to think that we each stand on our own, but I am a firm believer that it's always the woman behind the man, and that's Karen Campbell. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Well, there's the man behind the woman. Many. She leads me. Tells you what to eat.
Someone has to.
And that's why I'm so happy she's here. Not only are you Professor Emeritus at Cornell University in the nutrition biochemistry.
We have what was called a Division of Nutritional Sciences, which is the largest academic nutrition group in the country. And instead of calling it a department, we call it division, which is halfway between a department and a college. So we have a fairly strong, how should I say, academic sort of standing within the institution.
That's
and
phenomenal.
Nutritional biochemistry, that's my specialty. So there's some of us in that division are in nutritional biochemistry, others are in international nutrition, others in community nutrition, and so forth and so on.
Oh, I see. So all of your nutrition, though, study has come under that category.
Yes, division, yeah.
And I always like to tell people that don't be put off by the fact that the title of the book says The China Study, because it was really your son that helped you write it for lay people to understand. Am I correct?
Yes. In fact, he had been in theater, as you may recall, doing quite well in his new career, and then came back to write. Now he's a graduate from medical school. He's in residency, and he has actually been coming out lately and lecturing with me.
Oh, that's fabulous.
He's very excited. We're both very excited.
Now, he's gone on to study nutrition, hasn't he? Or
no,
plans to do that?
he's going to be a family medicine, that specialty. He's in residency right now.
Oh.
But obviously, with the experience he had with this,
He's already gotten a training better than most people.
He has more nutrition knowledge than most of my PhD students.
There's a film I called Forks Over Knives, and it's really the story of plant-based nutrition, but it really blends the two people that have brought so much of this together, you and Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn of Cleveland Clinic. Would you tell me how you met?
Dr. Esselstyn, now my very close friend, call him S, and his wife Ann, he noticed in the New York Times in 1990 or 1991, I can't recall, when our study in China was featured in the science section. He saw the headline and got quite excited about it, picked up the phone and called me to see if I might come to a conference he was organizing, because he had just some 4 or 5 years before that had gotten onto this idea with his patients. I'm coming from a scientific point of view, so he thought I ought to come and attend his conference. It was in Tucson, Arizona, so I did. And since then, we've spoken on the same platform many, many times, become very close friends. And what we both like to say, I mean, I'm representing the science background and policy, and he's representing the clinical community. It's perfect. I mean, what he had a different path from me, but when you put the two things together.
Yeah. What do you find is the most astounding part of your research that's you can just see the workings of the brain in the audience, or when you're talking to someone, you can just see those bits of information that really make a difference when people are listening to the research?
Well, I get a lot of feedback, like the usual email, letters, that kind of thing, or people writing about it, that this idea is really resonating with people. And now the kind of comments that people are making, and the people who are making these comments, they're not, these are people not necessarily in the choir, so to speak. These are people, just everyday people, just interested in what is this about. The kind of comments I'm getting now are really quite sophisticated. Well, in any case, what I'm seeing now compared to what I thought I was seeing maybe 15, 20 years ago or so when I really became convinced about this information. What I'm seeing now is a lot more interest on the part of the professional communities, as well as other professionals and very successful people, thinking kinds of people who previously might have thought of this as a kind of a strange idea, a bit of a fad diet maybe. Now it's become a serious discussion. And I spent about 20 years in national policy development, international policy development of food and health, so I had quite a lot of experience, at the national level and international level, helping governments and so forth and so on formulate policy, for the whole country. And I know at that level, the kind of things that go on that tend to impede this kind of information. And what I'm seeing now is that this kind of information first is now getting into the professional communities. I'm speaking the majority of my time in medical schools and medical conferences, but it's also, I think, beginning to now translate a little bit into public policy. And that's a tough sell, because public policy is going to represent, obviously, the whole of society, presumably. And there's a lot of powers that be don't want that to happen. And so I'm very excited about, it's part of the narrative. I think the words vegan and vegetarian, which I don't use, by the way, because vegetarians, about 90% of the vegetarians are still using dairy and eggs. So the nutrient composition of their diets is not that different from non-vegetarians. And so, there's not that much of a gain just for somebody to say I'm a vegetarian. I'm vegan.
Don't get it.
So vegans presumably have taken a step, presumably in the right direction by eliminating dairy and eggs. But the problem is that for many vegans, they've chosen that lifestyle for ideological reasons, if you will, not necessarily for health reasons, and so they aren't using the kind of food, the kind of diets that they really need to be using. What I'm referring to is they're not using a whole food plant-based diet, whole vegetables, whole fruits, whole grains. Number one, they're using too much processed food. I mean, their concern is not to use animal products. And of course they do that successfully. But the kind of foods that they are using is too much processed foods, meaning
Yes.
Adding too much oil, fat, if you will, salt and sugar. So
You mentioned something, if I could interrupt just a second, is the issue of oil. This has been the biggest surprise for me, and I think a lot of vegans, that kind of stops us short because we become so accustomed to having oil.
Yes, for people who are on a customary American diet and they want to make a change, let's say to this kind of diet, one of the more difficult things for them to do is to go to the low fat or no added oil kind of idea. The reason for that is because oil or fat is an addictive characteristic. We've all become addicted to a relatively high consumption of oil. I mean, really things change in our brain on the dopamine serotonin complex, for those who might be interested. And so, just like any other kind of chemical addiction, it takes a while to get past it. And so if a person just jumps right into this kind of diet, they may find it bland, they will. They're not accustomed to that kind of taste very much. But if after, maybe it'll take up to a month or so, and they kind of stick with it, or gradually change, maybe longer, and really stick with it, and use herbs and spices and flavors and so forth and so on in a more creative way, put foods together in a more creative way, then the food all of a sudden starts tasting quite good. And first thing you know, the taste preferences of that person has changed. Were they to go back, to the old way, the high oil content, they actually find it unpleasant.
Wow.
Physically as well as, in a taste sense.
Karen, how have you really managed that in the kitchen and still have flavor? Because we think of oil having the flavor. How do you substitute that?
After you stop using it, you just don't like the taste of it. You're just all greasy and it's not very good. But I use it I just saute my things in water. And course, you have your spices, so you have to use really nice spices and make it taste good.
Is salt okay?
A little, a lot of times I put very little salt. And then if they want more, you can put more at the table, but I don't usually have very much salt. Yeah. And I use in place of oil, you can use bananas for baking and applesauce and, different things like that. But we don't miss the oil, not now at all.
So when you're sauteing the vegetables, you have to keep watching it, and do you keep adding water then? Is it might cook away?
Yeah, you have to watch it, right? But it doesn't take very long.
And then the spices, do you put them in the water to cook at the same time, or do you add it later? Because I know
Usually
many
later,
times adding
or
salt.
both ways. Yeah, both ways.
I'm going to really press you now. What is his favorite dish?
Oh, that man likes anything you put in front of him.
So mixed vegetables usually, and then you add, do you ever add nuts or berries? I'm really pressing you for a dish here that you like to make.
Yeah, I use all of those things, berries and nuts. And I mean, every morning he'll have, what's is usually during the winter especially, his oatmeal with the raisins and fresh fruit. And that's usually his breakfast, bananas and so forth. And we've been starting lately, just for lunch, we'll have some greens cooked up. I'll cook up a nice big bunch of greens with some onions and with some beans in it. And then I have this lemon sauce I put over it. And we both just love that.
Well, how do you make the lemon sauce?
You put some lemon and lemon juice and some soy sauce and some, what's the third thing? Oh my gosh. Lemon, soy, mustard.
Oh,
Right,
that would be good.
Mustard, right.
That almost sounds a little Asian, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's very good. Yeah.
And what about roasted vegetables? Do you roast them as well as?
I do sometimes.
Because sometimes you think of putting oil on roasting vegetables. And it's really hard for me sometimes to roast the vegetables and not spritz a little bit of oil. But you do them without the oil?
Yeah, I do.
And then do you feel that maybe making them more moist before you put them in with water, or how do you find?
Now, if you put some parchment paper underneath, I mean, that keeps them really sticky. Right.
Very
So
good.
yeah.
I know that the background, you work with a lot of people in China. Could you describe just shortly, in a short way, how did you choose where you tested in China?
Well, China, at the time we got involved in the early 1980s, had published an atlas of cancer mortality rates for the whole of the country, about 2,400 counties. And what they learned and what we saw was that cancer, for maybe about a dozen different cancers, were very common in certain areas and not in others. So we had these pockets, these geographic pockets of cancer. So we went to China to simply survey. What were they eating? We took blood samples, we took urine samples. We asked questions. We just simply wanted to collect as much information as we could from a representative sample of villages, 130 actually. I mean, it was a big study. And so we collected these samples, analyzed them for everything. And it was from that perspective of measuring lots and lots of things to see if we could see how things work together, in a sense, as food, and what that said, about the role of nutrition in those diseases and others. And the Chinese government gave to us also the mortality rates for about another 3 dozen different kinds of diseases at that time. So we had infectious diseases and cancer and heart disease and diabetes and so forth. And because of the unique character of this study, in terms of its experimental study design, it was a unique kind of study, and a unique way that we did it compared to other people. We had the opportunity of having a look in a human population to see what happens when people move closer and closer and closer to a plant-based diet in terms of a whole variety of different kinds of nutrients. When they get closer and closer to that, low fat, what happens to heart disease, cancers, diabetes, and so forth. And as the animal protein decreased in China, and it was not very high to begin with. I mean, the average consumption of animal foods in rural China is only about 1/10 what we have. So very small amounts, but it turned out in some areas where they did have little significant amounts, as that decreased to close to zero. That's when heart disease and cancers and Western diseases began to decline and disappear. And we had other ways, biochemically and clinically, to measure things, like measuring blood cholesterol, different cholesterol fractions. It was complex kind of study, but
What do you feel is the most valuable information for any of us or anyone listening? If they're wanting to start, how do you begin?
well, information, of course, good information is almost an essential, I think, whether people want to read a book or get it from someplace else. The next thing is, I think, for those who aren't maybe too excited about the science, maybe, or other kinds of issues, they want to feel good. They really want to feel good. And well, I say, try it. We say that in our book, The China Study. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to understand exactly what I'm saying. Just try it. And that's a pretty good statement. Because when they do, and if they do it right, they see the differences. And that's the feedback we've been getting since the China Study came out. So many people said, I never would have thought that I would ever try this kind of thing.
Is that there's a film out called Forks Over Knives, and it's showing all over the country. I saw it twice in New York, and it's really the story of plant-based nutrition, but it really blends the two people that have brought so much of this together, you and Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn of Cleveland Clinic. Would you tell me how you met?
Dr. Esselstyn, now my very close friend, call him S, and his wife Ann, he noticed in the New York Times in 1990 or 1991, I can't recall, when our study in China was featured in the science section. He saw the headline and got quite excited about it, picked up the phone and called me to see if I might come to a conference he was organizing, because he had just some 4 or 5 years before that had gotten onto this idea, it's his patients. I'm coming from the scientific point of view, so he thought I ought to come and attend his conference. It was in Tucson, Arizona, so I did. And since then, we've spoken on the same platform many, many times, become very close friends. And what we both like to say, I mean, I'm representing the science background and policy, and he's representing the clinical community. Perfect. I mean, he had a different path from me, but when you put the two things together, it's
Yeah.
perfect.
So you complement each other so amazingly. So
Yes.